So real gross domestic product is our income. The amount of we spend on final goods and services turns out to be equal to income. And so at 1,000 units worked, there ends up being some amount of GDP. Let's just say it's 3,000 units. Maybe it's $3,000 million worth of gross domestic product. And so along this curve, we have different labor demanded, and that is the production function we did yesterday. Or not yesterday, Wednesday, Thursday, Monday. Jeez, I got too many days. All right, so that's kind of about where we left off. We defined labor demand, labor supply, so those should be in your notes. And we had a few of the shifters for each one. And now I want to talk about this one. This is a big one. So the wages. How do people make decisions on how much they're going to work? Is it worth it for them to go and work for an hour for $12? Everybody's going to have a different answer to that question, right? On what induces them to come up to work, and so different opportunity costs. And so what we want to calculate now is to take some inflation into account. Remember what we did with the interest rate? Interest for the loan. What was that formula we had that connected inflation and interest? So interest for a loan, little I. What was it? How did we calculate the real rate of return for the banker or for an investment? Yeah, Aaron? Oh, sorry. You were saying because bad, that wasn't a hand raised? Bryce?
You minus the your percent interest minus the percent of inflation.
Okay, good. So the real rate of return, the Fisher formula was this, and this should be in your notes too. So the stated interest rate at the bank says, I'll loan you money at 7%. But if the inflation rate was 3%, then we said that the real rate of return for the bank was actually 7 minus the 3. Why? Because the banker's loaning you money, but a year later when they take your money plus interest and they go to Walmart, the stuff on the shelves has grown by 3%. So we adjusted for inflation. Well, we need to do the same thing with your wages. So how many of you have a mom or a dad who's a nurse? Who's got a nurse mom or dad? Don't be bashful, I'm not going to pick on you too much here. Somebody's got a nurse mom or dad. Really? Nobody has a nurse mom or dad? Yeah, Jake?
Nurse grandma.
Nurse grandma. All right, let's use nurse grandma. And this could kind of be more broadly, not necessarily to Jake. Can we use your grandma's name?
Yeah.
What's her name?
Nancy.
Nancy. All right. So G-Ma, Nancy. Nurse Nancy. I kind of like that. We got 2 N's. Nurse Nancy. So Grandma Nurse Nancy currently makes $22 an hour. So Nancy makes $22 an hour and has made that for the last 3 years. So her wage, let's use a big W, I'll tell you a little while, her stated wage in 2019 was $22. So So the wage was $22. And so we call that her nominal wage. This was, recall, the nominal interest rate. We used the nominal word another time too. Who remembers when we used the nominal word? When we calculated, what was it? Nominal what? GDP. GDP. So nominal GDP had not been corrected for inflation. When we corrected it, we call it real GDP. Interest rates that aren't corrected for inflation are called nominal interest rates. Once they're corrected, it's called the real rate of interest. And so now what we're going to think about is the real wage for Nurse Nancy. All right, so nominal wage is 19. I'm sorry, nominal wage is 22. So she is excited to get a $1 raise in 2020. She's excited to get a $1 raise in 2020. If the price level in 2017, 3 years prior, if the price level in 2017 was equal to, we'll keep the numbers easy here. Maybe we shouldn't keep them. Let's keep them a little harder. The price level was equal to 109 in 2017. I put 100 at first. If I would have put 100, what's unique about the price level being 100? It's at the base year, right? So we had the base year price. It was the Aiden base year price, right? When we went through that, the Aiden base year price. So they would have been the base year price. But so let's just say the base year was sometime in the past. But we know that the price level was currently at 109. So if the price level in 2017 is 109, and the price level in 20 is equal to 121, should Nancy be that excited? Or how excited should she be? Okay, so that's kind of where we're at. So what we want to think about is, what is the wage? What is she really getting paid in both years? So to calculate that, we need to deflate the nominal wage by the price level, which is actually the same thing we did when we did nominal GDP and real GDP. So the price level using the GDP deflator was nominal GDP over real GDP. If we do a little mathematical wizardry here, the real GDP is equal to the nominal GDP divided by the price level. Right? Everybody see that? All they did is kind of do a little flippity-floppity. And so nominal GDP divided by the price level gives you the real GDP, which is what we essentially did in those tables. And so now we want to do the same thing for the wage. So my question is, what is the real wage, which we'll be using for my lecture notes, a little script W. So this is big W, like capital W with a big W. What is the real wage in 2017 and 2020 for Nancy? We're going to use that same thing here, the real wage is equal to the nominal wage divided by the price level. So for instance, the nominal wage in maybe I should go that, you guys are too crazy. In 06 is the 06 nominal wage divided by the 06 price level. Okay? I'll walk around the room. You guys start calculating that. You can work with your neighbor. Go ahead and pull out your cell phone if you want to use as a calculator. We'll tuck it away later, but put it on airplane mode. Try not to check out the latest Twitter feed or anything. Just kind of go straight to your calculator if you would. And calculate what the real wage is for Nancy. So essentially what I'm asking you to do here is calculate the real wage for 17 and the real wage for 20. As soon as you get an answer, shout it out. And extra credit point goes to that person if they're correct. I take that back, it'll go to them even if they're not.
$19 for
$19 for 2020. So right or wrong. Now, last semester, I had a clever guy. I can't remember his name. Actually, I think he ended up dropping out, honestly, but he was very clever. I wish he would have stayed in. Did you guys hear what I said?
Yeah, you're wrong.
I said a wrong point. He freaking automatically said $13. Because I said I'll give you an extra credit point even if you're wrong, right? So nobody here is jumping on that. You got to listen to me. Sometimes I like to come up with some crazy stuff here to keep class lively. So, okay, so right or wrong, Bryce is going to get the extra. Oh, it was Jacob? You said it? Okay, sorry, I thought I heard. All right. And I don't know if you're right or right, but right or not, but what did you say it was? $19 for 2020. Okay, so Jacob says $19 for 2020. 20 for 17. Okay. What's your name? Ben? So this is for 17 and this is for 20. 19. Got 20. So we're starting to hone in. All right. So hopefully if we got it. Now, one thing that you guys might have saw, I didn't do the adjustment, but the price level is 109. When you actually enter the calculator, do you want to do 22 divided by 109? 22 divided by 109. Is that what you actually want to punch into your calculator? What do you want to do to get 20? Do your guys' answers look too big unless you did something a little bit differently or you did some sort of adjustment? Multiply by 100. So remember we did that 100 business where we slid the decimal place over a couple spots for the price level? So really this formula is kind of dividing the 109 by 100. I find that it just confuses students if I actually write a formula for that, dealing with the 100. So you kind of know, but really you're dividing by 1.09. So 22 divided by 1.09. I should have some change here too. What is the answer? 20.18. Okay, so, and then what is the answer now with Nurse Nancy getting $23 in 2020 divided by our 121, which is actually 1.21 equals 1901. So, should Nurse Nancy be excited? No. Now, what is the interpretation of that? I mean, it's kind of, you know, the flip side of this is like, is $1 more better than nothing more? Yeah, right. So what's going on that Nurse Nancy, if she had taken a macro class, would be kind of keeping track of here? What has the employer not been doing? Adjusting for inflation, which adjusts for what? How is that impactful for Nurse Nancy?
Cost of living.
Cost of living, how is it impactful in her real life? When she runs to Walmart, she can buy less stuff. So when she goes to Walmart with her $22 wage, in, let's say, 2018, and she pulled off tomato soup and ramen noodles and a pair of clothes and whatever, her shopping cart doesn't have as much stuff as it did last year when her wage stayed at 22, assuming there was some amount of inflation, right? So her real purchasing power here is reflected in what we just calculated. It's $1, what are we at here, $1.17? So $1.17 less of stuff from when she started the job, or I didn't say she started it then, but from 2017, the last time she had a wage increase to 2020, her shopping cart has $1.17 of less stuff in it, right? There's less items. So that's her real wage. Okay, questions or comments on that? You get kind of the what's going on here with inflation? All right, so up here, economists assume that people in general are taking that into account. Now, we know that they're not really taking into account. In the United States, if inflation's pretty low, it's not something we worry about too much. So we're going to get to the money and banking chapter next week, and we'll learn like where inflation comes from and whatnot. So having a low, stable inflation rate makes us not have to worry too much about it. But eventually, Nurse Nancy and other people are like, I haven't gotten a raise in a while. I haven't ever had an econ class, but I've heard on the news, and I know that prices seem more expensive at the gas pump, at Walmart. It seems like prices are always just kind of inching up on me. I think I'm going to go ask my employer for a wage. You see how she's feeling inflation, not necessarily calculating inflation? Right? That's the way the real world works, is that I think people do take inflation into account. Now, they become acutely aware of it if they live in a country where there's high inflation. If inflation is 10, 12, 20%, let alone 10, 12, 20% per month, which is happening in places like Venezuela and some other places. So some high inflation, all of a sudden you're on this, like you know how to calculate it. You're like, we gotta do something, right? But in the United States, where we enjoy relatively low inflation, we don't have to worry about as much, but we still act on it. So the variable that we measure on the vertical axis here is the real wage, not the nominal wage. So this is an inflation-adjusted wage that we're using. Okay, I'm going to put a couple of summary comments, but any last comments on the calculation here? Everybody cool with it? All right, so therefore, Nancy has $1.17 of reduced purchasing power compared to her 2017 wage. And let me put the nominal wage here, just so nominal wage of $22. So Nancy has $1.17 of reduced purchasing power compared to her 2017 nominal wage of 22. So in other words, her $23 nominal wage. So Nancy's nominal wage of 23, her $23 nominal wage has $1.17 of reduced purchasing power compared to her nominal wage of 22 back in 2017. Okay. So last section then of this labor chapter, then we're going to move on to investments. They're not sliding that eraser. I don't feel efficient unless I'm running dual exhaust on erasers. We want to think about activities that promote economic growth, which is what I'm speaking to the Kansas Senators tomorrow on. What can we be doing to get some economic growth? So we have, let's see, three growth theories that we'll look at. Three growth theories. Number one is we have what's called the classical growth theory. Pretty much defunct. But this was put forward as kind of the first thing, and it's a little bit depressing. So Thomas Malthus, back in the 1800s, looked at economic growth this way, which of course in the 1800s, he's looking at early 1800s, looking at the United States. What type of economic activity is the primary thing in the early 1800s and into the 1700s? I mean, what does life look like in terms of economic activity? What type of activities are people likely doing? Farming, right? So a lot of agriculture, a lot of what we call subsistence living, right? So we have some people, some of our poor, subsistence living. What does that mean if you're just doing subsistence living? Living with what? Yeah, paycheck to paycheck, that sort of thing, right? So I work, but it's really only getting me my basic necessities. And so farming, back in those days, they'd actually be producing the food, right? Whether they're raising some farm animals and doing their own growing. So we had kind of subsistence living / farming. Now, they still had economics, though. What were the basic resources? Land, check. They're a farmer. They maybe own some land, right? Labor and capital. So how many tractors are around in the 1700s? Zero. So what was capital for them? Ox and them, and they had like the plow of some sort that would be hooked up to the animals, right? But there was still capital. And then finally labor. So if you're a farmer, you're a family farmer, you're pretty much subsistence living, how do you increase your resource base?
Get another worker.
Get another worker, good. How do you get workers if you're a farmer, subsistence living, you've got some land?
Have a kid.
Have a kid, have lots of kids, crank out the kids, right? So we had big families back then, in part because there was a lot of work to do, right? We had a lot of work, we got to kind of crank out some workers. All right, so here's what Thomas Malthus kind of said, is that, I'll just make kind of a little tongue-in-cheek here. So to get more labor, make babies. And then he went a little further to say that population growth is the result of income growth. So population growth is the result of income growth. So we looked at last chapter per capita income, per capita real GDP was equal to our GDP, our income, divided by the population. So the prediction that the classical economists came up with is that this goes up, and then we make more babies, and this goes up, which leads to no increase in per capita GDP. So he's kind of made famous by calling economics the dismal science. Like, that's a little depressing. Like, we're always going to be poor and hungry in subsistence living. We won't ever break out of the subsistence living. So therefore, subsistence living is the long-term norm. Subsistence living is the long-term norm. All right, well, you guys know that this turned out not to be true. So I just like, it's kind of important to start off that through that lens. So what happened in the 1800s, early 1800s? What sort of revolution? The Industrial Revolution, right? So we started to have the accumulation of capital that allowed us to kind of break through this. That instead of just making babies, we had really productive machines where it might have taken, 15 people to do a job. Now one person can do it with the advancement of that. So we had an increase in productivity due to the accumulation of capital. So number 2 here, the next kind of growth theory to look at is called Neoclassical Growth. And so this brought in an increase in technology, leads to an increase in savings and investment, which is an increase in capital, right? So here, if you want to put industrial revolution type of stuff, we end up getting the connection of thinking about technology. And the increase in machines leads to an increase in per capita real GDP. Income per person now can go up because we've added more machines for each person to use. So then, I guess kind of the but, if we put the labor and the capital here, the production function that we have, that we just drew earlier, I just kind of quickly put it up here, labor and output. By adding more machines, we still have diminishing growth. So the classical economists, here there was still a limiting factor. So we're still limited by diminishing returns to capital. All right, so now I think you guys can probably pick out where the last one goes. This is called new growth theory. What's the missing link here? We started with people. Let's increase people, right? And increasing people led to that result. Let's increase machines. But machines have this limiting factor. What's the piece of the puzzle that's missing here that probably contributes to nations having nice economic growth? Technology, good. And where does technology come from? How do we develop new things? What is technology? Trade is another thing. Good. I'm glad you mentioned that. We saw the win-win situation. So as we open our borders, that allows us to have consumption beyond our own production possibilities. So that's definitely one, too, that we'll hit on. So education, yes. So what if we make these people smarter and more productive, right? So we have kind of this industrial revolution with machines getting better and more, and the accumulation of physical capital. But then as we move more into the 20th century, we start to say, oh, smart people come up with even new things, right? And so having that dynamic is the kind of the next revolution in a sense. So the new growth theory here is that technology and knowledge can lead to unlimited growth. Not subject to diminishing returns the same way capital is. So now let's draw another picture that kind of captures the idea here. So draw the same one we did before, where that's the production function with diminishing returns, just like this picture. And let's just put a point A, maybe right here, point A. Let's say that the economy is currently at LA and YA for point A. If we have advancements in technology, what happens to and knowledge growth and education, what happens to the production function? It goes up. So now, imagine this going up. I want you to draw 4 of them. As we move through time, we go from PF 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. So if we're moving pretty quickly in technological advance and the accumulation of knowledge and education, it's conceivable that the economy might move from A to B to C to D. And so the path of the economy actually looks like that instead of diminishing. So it's possible we can see really high rates of growth in income without the prediction of bumping into the limited returns or diminishing returns like we did before. Some of that's due to the nature of technology. How is well, first of all, let's pin down what technology is. So how is what exactly is technology? Like we always say, well, there's new technology, and we kind of hold up one of these, right? So technological advance, what is technology? Is it a physical phone, or is it a physical machine? What is technology? If there's a new technology, what's really entered our planet?
New way to improve life.
A new way to improve life. Jonathan, you want to add on to that? Something that's more efficient, right? So a different process. So it's really information, right? Now, as tragic as it was, I mean, information is also like Kobe Bryant's tragedy on Sunday, right? That is information. But we wouldn't say that that information is technology, right? So what is it about technology? Technology is information, but information is not necessarily technology. You know, if we were doing a little Venn diagram or something, there's information. Technology is a subset of information. What makes technology technology? As opposed to just information. What does technology do, Aaron?
Something that's already created.
And keep going, and then what? Because I think I like what you're adding on, but you kind of got, well, maybe I don't know what I'm adding on. Yeah, okay, and so it's the using it part. So how is we call it technology when it does what for us? Makes things easier, makes things, right? So when we think about our process of converting land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, we take these resources and out comes a basketball. Taking resources and converting them into final goods and services, technology makes that increase in productivity. So there's something that has changed how productive some of these resources are. The land is more productive because we put fertilizer into it. The fertilizer was engineered by some chemist that did experiments that came up with it. That was the technology. What did the technology do? We used to only make 100 basketballs, and now we can make 110. That information created value to the production process. That's what makes it technology, right? Instead of just information. So when we think about technology, you can start to think of it as being an input, like the other resources, an input into the production process. Well, you might ask, well, Russ, why don't we call it a resource? Because if we have technology sitting out here as a thought, is it really doing what I just said? No. The thought needs to manifest itself into one of these. A new way for workers to work on something. A new way to make the land more fertile. A new way for the machine to work better, right? So technology gets embodied in these things, and that's why it's kind of held aside. At a given point in time, these things already embody the current technology, the previous technology. It's not technology until it gets kind of put into place. Okay, questions or comments on that? All right, so that's kind of the growth theory business. Let's see. So we're going to spend more time on this in the future, but what are the things that help promote growth? How do we get more education? How do we, yeah, human capital. So should we just have, the government force kids to go to school? Does that work? Were you guys forced to go to school? Did everybody benefit the same way, being forced to go to school? Did everybody become a productive part of the workforce after being forced to come to school? Right. So that doesn't necessarily work. So what I want to think about is what's the real underlying things that help promote growth? Well, this is, again, something we're going to study more, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But the Economic Freedom Index, which is part of what I'm talking to the Senate about tomorrow, looks at those primary factors. And is Kansas doing well or not? Is the United States doing well or not? Are other countries doing well or not? And so here are those basic areas. You guys mentioned some already. Freedom to trade internationally. In your country, do you have regulations, tariffs, and other things that keep trade from occurring? If you do, you're inhibiting growth. That's kind of an anti-growth type of thing if you're not having policies that give you more freedom to trade. Sound money. So area number 3, inflation. Do you have an economy? Is your government doing something that creates high inflation? If you're doing that, it becomes hard for people to do their own trades, right? And to figure out what would be best for themselves. Legal system and property rights. Do you have a good court system? Do you have non-corrupt police? that enforce the law of the land that protects individual property rights. Right? So that whole thing can be something to be looked at. Not every country is equal on that. And then up here, the size of government. How much is the government spending? How much are they collecting? So are we keeping money in private hands where they can voluntarily figure out with their brain what win-win situation they want to partake in? Or is more money shifted to government where some smart people in Washington, D.C. are figuring out how to make you better off, right? That's kind of the difference with how much freedom you have on the tax rate. So we look at government spending and how much tax rates, and then finally the amount of regulation in different areas. Do we have restrictions on how much people can work or whether they can't work? There was a policy in India that you can't fire your workers. Still kind of exists to some extent today. I think it's getting a little more minimized. But imagine that the law of the land is you can't fire somebody. If you hire them, they've got a job for life. How does that sound for flexibility? How does that sound for the incentive for the employee to keep working hard for you? Once they get in, the incentives get distorted potentially, right? So what kind of regulations are there within countries, the law of the land, on business regulations and red tape that they have to cut through to get through things? So again, we'll spend all time, but that's what you'll see in this chapter towards the end in a little bit different way. We're just going to go a little more intensively. They don't talk about the indexing per se. That's what our chapter, our week 7 is going to look like. But similar things are being measured here. Region, rule of law, civil liberties, what type of system? Is it market-based system or communist system? Human capital, that'd be education, physical capital. So all the stuff we've been talking about, you'll see kind of come up. And this is the way the author depicts this new growth theory, that we desire to have things, we have incentives in a market system that creates an innovation, we have new techniques and new firms, and we have this, what some people call a virtuous cycle, that it all kind of builds on itself for economic growth. Okay, so that kind of closes out this chapter. Any last questions or comments on economic growth? It's a topic we're going to continue to talk about the whole term. So this is kind of the foundational stuff for economic growth and thinking about the labor part of it. All right. Oh, you know what? I only got the screen down. I think I'm going to show you this video. You guys want a video break? Let's see. I got it. I might be able to find it pretty quickly. This is a cool video. I like to show it in macro, especially. We go to YouTube. Hans. Oh, what's his name? Rolling. Rosling. 200 countries, 200 years. This is such a famous one.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global health. And I know having the data is not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before. Animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew. So, here we go. First, an axis for health. Life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person. $400, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor, life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa. And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology, and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner. Well, what you have seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
All right, so that is kind of a cool way to think about some of the stuff that we were just working through. That's this picture essentially, right? Because we had 100 years. He started back in what year was it? 1810, right? And we worked through 1910, 1948. We took the snapshot of things getting good, and then we saw all the action happening, right? So that's kind of this explosive growth that would have been pretty difficult. What's true about this technology and information and education that's a little different than physical resources? How do they travel around? Is it hard to transport like a big machine? Is it hard to transport information? Like information that's technology? No. So you've got a machine that you might have to build in the United States. But if that machine's really cool and it harvests crops at a faster rate or something, can that thing make its way over to Africa? Might be hard to ship it, but what about the blueprints of how to make it? And then that company now makes it in Africa, right? So information, as you guys know, you can start having a conversation in no time with somebody in India, right? It's easy. So it's amazing the transformation in communication. We've really had a different type of revolution. In fact, Jim Gortney's written a paper about this, and I might even hear more about it on Friday, on what he's calling the communication and transportation revolution. So the fact that we have a large population around the globe having cell phones and having the ability to do banking, I mean, that's a game changer. That's a monumental shift that's happened just in your lifetimes. I mean, this has just happened in the last 10 years that we've had that type of access. And so that's the type of thing that's kind of exciting about looking at economic growth and hopefully bringing people who are in poverty out of those conditions. There's a lot of optimism with the use of markets and some of these economic concepts. All right, so our next topic, which is part of this week's homework here, is our loanable funds market. So we're going to focus in on investment and savings. So we kind of hinted at it with the savings and investment right here, technology and savings and investment, the accumulation of capital. That's an important link in this whole business. And so we have a couple definitional things. I want to think about how our labor bucket changes. So investment. So this is chapter 24, right? 24. Savings and investment. Okay, so if we think about our capital bucket, right, it has a certain level. At a point in time, we have a certain amount of machines. So the capital bucket is the stock of capital. It's a stock variable. And then over the course of a year or some time frame, we have investment flowing in to the bucket. So the I is investment. And this is the I from our cigarettes, C plus I plus G plus X. This is that I, right? So investment in econ class is not stocks and bonds, but rather the purchases of buildings, machines, and computers and other things, stuff that helps make other stuff. So the purchases of capital. And so that's flowing into this bucket, causing the bucket level to rise. But there's a hole in our bucket, and we have some depreciation. Things become obsolete, and it leaks out. And so one of the terms that we're going to have kind of balancing that out is the amount of net investment is equal to gross investment minus depreciation. And that's what my little bucket here is capturing. The amount coming out of the spigot minus the amount that's exiting the bucket is going to make the bucket level go up or down. If depreciation is bigger than the investment, the bucket level is going to fall. If it goes up, if the gross investment's greater, it's going to go up. All right, so all of that kind of helps with the stock, help us think about the stock of capital in the economy. Let's get rid of this little nagging cough here. So one of the figures in your book kind of nicely brings together the connection here January 1st, this says 2014 to, it could be the end of the year. So beginning of the year, end of the year, bucket level, depreciation, gross investment, so that's our inflow. The difference is, at the end of the day, we had more capital stock go up. So initial capital plus the net investment gives us the new level of capital. So we have capital accumulation. So that kind of gives you a little feel for the flows of things at kind of this macro level, trying to keep track of all that, which isn't easy, keeping track of all the ins and outs. There's errors that they make and other things with the amount of capital. So we're going to model that effect with what we call the loanable funds market. So the loanable funds market brings together borrowers and lenders to finance purchases. So, if we think about our marketplace, who are the borrowers? Who borrows money? People for consumer loans and house mortgages and stuff. So households, thinking back to our market, we've got households and businesses. And one more. I'll give you a hint, it's on this picture. Government, yes. So these are the economic agents of our economy, households, governments, and businesses, and then we have the rest of the world. All of these guys do this, right? So potentially everybody's a borrower. The primary borrower, though, turns out to be businesses. So businesses represent the largest fraction of borrowing. So I'm going to just list them first. Businesses, households, and government. I probably should have put government ahead of households. Households tend to kind of cancel each other out because one person's saving and another person's borrowing. But businesses end up being net borrowers. So that's who we're going to focus in on as kind of our key borrower. So this is the key person. But we're also going to have in future chapters, governments don't collect enough taxes to pay for their spending, so they need to borrow. And we already know households borrow for lots of things in different ways. Hopefully, if you take my personal finance class, we'll teach you some techniques on how to maybe just borrow for a house and nothing else, and to pay off that debt and become rich. Filthy rich, I might add. All right, and so then the borrowers here. The lenders. Out of this group, which one of these are lenders? Households, government, and potentially businesses. All three of them, again, are potential. Now, I'm going to put them in a different order, though. So households are the primary lenders. So households, businesses, and government. The United States government is a big-time borrower, not a lender. But China is actually a pretty good lender. So we borrow from China has been the evolution of things that we'll get into actually a little bit in this chapter. So those are all true, but for kind of our purposes for starting off this model, it's good to think of, because they're the largest, households being kind of the lenders for the most part, and businesses being the borrowers. And your textbook will have kind of some levels of actual data on how much of that those folks make up in each role. All right, so I think it kind of, let's do, before I jump into the supply and demand curve, let's kind of look at this thing. All right, here we go. I don't know if I got a smaller one. Yeah. All right, we'll start here. So we'll start with Tom and Jan. Okay, so remember we started off the course with this thinking about our island nation. And then these guys figured out that they could have some win-win situations with trade. We kind of scaled that up to the big story of thinking about our resources in buckets and trying to satisfy unlimited wants with limited resources. And so now we can think about businesses here and how they operate with land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Maybe it's all of those things combined rather than thinking about buckets. So there's the picture we just drew with how the levels of stuff changes. There's the physical production process. Nothing to do with dollars, but kind of that amazing production function that we just got out of this last chapter, right? We use these resources, a certain amount of resources will make the stuff, almost an engineering problem. And then we get the specialization in trade. So there's our market system without the government. There's our government. I'll just kind of hint at this since it's up here. If we don't collect enough money down here and at the cash register, then what we're spending in different ways, we need to go borrow it. So that's going to bring the government into this market for loanable funds. They're going to need to borrow some funds. So we'll kind of circle back to that a little bit later. Then we got the rest of the world picture, C plus I plus G plus X, our cigarettes. And now, kind of finally to where I want to be and thinking about the savings. Okay, so here's the decision for our little person. How much money do I put in the bank? How much money do I spend at pizza time on Main Street? Right? So you're making that decision with your income in a given year. You're going to devote it towards what economists call consumption, which in our cigarettes, C plus I plus G plus X, our consumption is this. Or you might say, I'm going to save for consumption tomorrow, so future consumption. So tomorrow's dollar I'm going to put. When you make that decision, it enters the financial markets, right? So the pizza cuts through the goods market and you give your money to pizza time. The bank method ends up cutting through the financial markets. And they end up having money, more money, to be able to lend to somebody who's willing to pay more in interest than what they're paying you. Right? So banks make money by charging interest to businesses for loans on equipment that help make other stuff, right? And that's the function that they're serving. It was more than what they paid you. So that's the banking industry. And so the question is, what's the difference if we buy a tractor this year as opposed to the pizza? So if we're making those decisions, how does that impact economic growth? Economic growth is C plus I plus G plus X. So instead of $100 of pizza, I'm buying 100 tractors, $100 of tractor. If I shift it from the C category to the I category, nothing happens today, this year, in terms of growth from that single maneuver. You guys with me on that? This is the part that gets missed by most people. So what happens in terms of economic growth today? Nothing. But what happens tomorrow? That tractor is still there. The pizza has been pooped out a long time ago. The pizza evaporated. The tractor persists for free. You're like, wait a second, the farmer had a loan or whatever, right, to get the tractor, so it's not free to him, he's making interest payments. Yeah, but the banker put up the money. It was somebody's money, right, that got the tractor. So we have a $500,000 tractor now that is sitting on our island. Instead of pizza being pooped out over here, I carry to the next time period a tractor that now can be produced at no cost in the aggregate. Now I'm talking macro now, right? So if we're God looking down on the island, pizza purchased and pooped, poof, it looks the same next year. But now I'm God looking at the island, pizza given up and exchanged for a tractor. Now the island all of a sudden has a tractor on it the next year. You with me? So it's a fundamental difference of what we're doing with our money can lead to greater economic growth. Okay, questions or comments on that? All right, so this is kind of the accumulation of the wealth of the nation. You saw the pizza move away there. I'm pretty proud of this little graphic, actually. I made this years ago. See that pizza? Watch. Click. Oh, that's so awesome. All right, so sorry, I guess, we got to have simple things here. So the wealth of our nation, then, back to Adam Smith's question, what is the nature and causes of wealth of nations? Capital accumulation, the decisions that we're making, whether we're doing pizza or tractors, education and knowledge transfers, right? All of that stuff leads to the wealth of nations. All right, so here's this chapter's kind of math. This is probably the most mathematical part that we're going to play on. So funding investment. So the amount of money that we're doing with purchases has to come from savings of somebody else. Somebody chose to save some money in order for somebody to go and buy the tractor, right? So the amount of loanable funds, the amount of investment has to have been derived from savings. So those three agents, putting all of our other agents out here, private saving by households, government possibly saving, which basically doesn't happen, by the way, but we'll talk about that more. So potentially the government collected more taxes than what they spent, which then would have additional money in the financial markets that would be saving. So we got grandma and grandpa saving money in their account. We've got the government potentially saving money in their account. And then we've got foreigners. So imports minus exports. Now, when we do the cigarettes business, C plus I plus G plus X, what's the X equal to at the end? It's net exports, but what's the equation for net exports? On the C plus I plus G, what's the X at the end for our cigarettes? Exports minus imports. That's not what that one says. So, if we have a trade deficit like we do in the United States, right? We purchase more from China than they buy from us. So which one's bigger again, imports or exports? Imports. So when we do the cigarettes equation, exports minus imports equals a negative number, right? Which means we didn't give them as much of our stuff as they gave ours, so who do we owe money to? Them. We owe them money if we have a trade deficit. So what they can do is say, all right, I'll take your marker, I'm going to hold an IOU, and they loan us the money. In fact, what we are short is exactly what they loaned us. So this is foreign savings. This is the Chinese buying bonds or government bonds and other forms of investment. We can have foreigners invest. So U.S. purchases of tractors can be funded by American households, governments, or the rest of the world. That's the only way the funds could come. Okay? Questions on that? All right, so if G is greater than T, holding these other things constant, what happens to I? If G is greater than T, put on your math hat now and just think about the formula. If G's, it decreases, right? So there's kind of a new thing for this chapter. It's called crowding out. Crowding out. If the government doesn't pay their bills right, if they don't have taxes covering their spending, one of the negative effects that can cause is less tractors for private people to be doing farming, less capital investment. So we say that the government is crowding out private investment. So it's called the crowding out effect. We'll kind of circle back to that one too, but this equation kind of helps see that in a different way. All right. So questions there? All right, I think that's it. We're gonna. Oh, yeah, this will be fun. No, we'll come back to that one later. All right, so let's set up our marketplace now. We're ready to get into the heavy-duty, heavy lifting here. So now our supply and demand is going to be based off loanable funds, LF. So loanable funds, LF. This is the quantity of loanable funds that is adjusted for inflation. So it's the real quantity of loanable funds. And then the price of money, what does it cost you when you go to buy money at a bank? I know we don't use terms that way, but I want you to think about, we go to McDonald's, we buy a cheeseburger. We go to a bank, and you want to buy some money. What do you have to pay to buy some money at a bank? Interest, right? So truly, the price of money is the interest rate. The bank says, oh yeah, I'll cut you $5,000, but you got to pay me $5,500 next year, right? The interest rate captures the price of money. You are literally going to when you get a loan, and you can think of it as like you're buying money. It's kind of weird, right? You usually think, well, I'm just borrowing money. Well, you are, but because of the contract and the terms that you're doing to pay it back. But you're kind of buying or loaning the money in a sense, renting the money, if you will, and the rent is the interest rate. So it's kind of similar to buying your housing. If you guys go and get an apartment, you pay $500 rent, you're going to use that apartment for a year, but you don't own the apartment, right? Got to turn it back. Okay, so the interest rate that we're going to use is the real rate of interest. So I'll put the Fisher formula up there since we did that last chapter. So we got the real interest rate, takes into account inflation. And then let's just go ahead and draw some lines in here. We got the demand for loanable funds and the supply of loanable funds. All right, so I guess I'll stick over here. Well, maybe not. So the demand for loanable funds, DLF line, so the idea here is that businesses are our main borrowers. So businesses desire more funds to increase investment when it costs less, a decrease in the real interest rate, when it costs less to do so. Given expected profit. So the first part of that describes why this thing is downward sloping. As the interest rate falls, it's cheaper to borrow money, so it's less costly for me to go buy a tractor, right? So a decrease in the interest rate causes me to want to borrow more money because the tractor's cheaper. If I'm going to be borrowing anyway, it's inducing me to borrow more. So interest rate falls, there's a higher demand for loanable funds. But that's given an expected profit level. So if there's an increase in expected profit, if there's an increase in expected profit, what happens to this relationship? So again, this thing was drawn for a certain level of expected profit. Expected profits were equal to, let's say, 10%. If we think about rates of return in terms of profitability. So I'll use this notation a little bit too, superscript E. So expected profit is 10%. So when I was expecting profits of 10%, this was my behavior. If interest rates were 10%, I borrowed this amount. If interest rates were 7%, I would have borrowed this amount. If interest rates were 3%, I would have borrowed this amount, right? So that's what the demand for labor, or the demand for loanable funds shows. So now, if I expect profits to be 15%, what happens to that? Taylor? Line shifts. So at 10%, I used to want to borrow this amount, now I want to borrow this amount. At 7%, I used to want to borrow this, now I want to borrow this. At 3%, I used to want to borrow this, but now I want to borrow this. Because at every interest rate, I'm now expecting profits to be 15%. Now, when businesses are bullish, we call the bull market when you're thinking rosy about the future, and if profit expectations are high, what's going to happen to real world interest rates today? Are they going to go up or down? Up. That's this new equilibrium point, right? So we started here where interest rates put a little more meat on the bones here. So let's say interest rates were at 6%. That's the real rate of interest, bear in mind. Inflation, nominal rate minus inflation rate. And people were borrowing LF1. Again, just making up some numbers, 1,000 million here or something. That's when profit expectations were 10%, but if they become 15%, then we have a shift up. So the new demand for loanable funds at a profit expectations of 15% would lie to the right of where the old one was. So if expected profits increase, then there'll be an increase in the demand for loanable funds, a shift to the right. So expected profit, the same thing we held constant, that is a DLF shifter. Expected profits are going to change businesses' behavior in how much they want to borrow at every interest rate. So on the example that I'm doing here, the new equilibrium, 6% would be too low. There would be a shortage, so businesses get the signal, and let's say, just making up some numbers again, interest rates climb to 8%, and maybe loans grow by $200 million. Okay, questions on that? Same type of technique. So now that you guys, I know some of you, this is macro is your first class, but every time I give a definition like this, whatever I say given or holding constant, the next thing ends up being the shifter thing, right? So what we're measuring on the vertical axis is the thing that a decrease in interest rates causes us to move. That's not a shifter. That's just a movement along. So if interest rates fall, holding expected profits at 10%, we just move from one to the next. But if expected profits change, that changes the whole curve. It moves to a different spot. Okay, so supply of loanable funds. Supply of loanable funds. The SLF curve. The lower the real rate of interest is, the lower little r is, the lower the opportunity cost, the sneak-in opportunity cost of consumption is. The lower the real rate of return is, the lower the opportunity cost of consumption. There's that word opportunity cost, one of the top principles of economics. I'm talking about these guys now. Who are these guys? Who's the suppliers, the primary supply of loanable funds? Who's it coming from? Households. So that's where we kind of got to think about the hat that's being worn. So businesses were demanding funds, and we've got households supplying funds. So this is saying that at lower interest rates, like 3%, people are only willing to supply a little bit. So the lower the interest rate is, the lower the opportunity cost of consumption is. So the lower the price of pizza is today in terms of opportunity cost. What was in that picture? What am I trying to get at here? If I eat pizza today, what am I not doing? Not buying the tractor, or in their world, just saving the money for future pizzas, right? Because their saving is actually for future pizzas. So we're kind of thinking about the trade-off between consumption today and consumption tomorrow. So let me put that in here, parentheses, consumption today versus consumption tomorrow, which is the economist's fancy way of calling savings. So consumption tomorrow means you're saving today. So if interest rates are low, does that give you incentive to save today? No. It's like, oh, they're only 2%, 1%? Shoot, might as well just buy some pizza, right? So we're going to save less money. I wanted to present it to you that way, even though it's kind of odd, to get you thinking about the trade-off between consumption and savings. There's always that trade-off going on between consumption today and consumption tomorrow. So the lower the interest rate is, the lower the opportunity cost of consumption is, and the greater, or the less, the less saving that occurs today. Given, so that's kind of why this thing is upward sloping. Now, it's easy to think about the saving thing. To kind of not be so cutesy about it here, I just wanted to get you thinking about that. Interest rates are high. Should I save my money? Do I have more incentive to save my money today? Sure. Right? Interest rates are high. I'm going to get a higher rate of return on my money. I'm going to save more money. So it's kind of easy to think through the logic that way. A little more difficult to think about this trade-off with consumption business. All right, given let's not put my. Given disposable income, a new variable we're going to look at, y subscript d. I'll get to that in a second. Disposable income, comma, my wealth, and my expected future income. Y subscript E, my expected future income. All right, so those three things are going to do what to the supply loanable funds curve? What are the, I gave you the hint here. Every time you see the word given, what's going to happen to this thing if one of those change? It's going to shift either up or down. It's going to move, right? So those end up being the shifters. So let's just put SLF shifters. Number one, disposable income is your income minus your taxes. Income minus taxes is disposable income. If we have an income tax of little t, hang on to your hats here, y minus little t times y. So if we have an income tax rate, little t, of 20%, check it out. If I have a 20% tax rate and a $1,000 paycheck, how much is my paycheck? 800 bucks. How'd you get that? 1,000 minus 20% times 1,000 is the 200. 1,000 minus 200 equals 800. Right? So you'll see this equation kind of come up. We can also factor out that y, and so you might also see it presented this way. 1 minus the tax rate times the income. 1 minus 20% is 80%. 80% of my 1,000 is 800. Just another way to rewrite the formula. So don't let that scare you too much. All right, so the reason we have this one in here is that if there's an increase in disposable income, what's going to happen to the savings supply curve, you think? If people have more disposable income, they're going to shift to the right or to the left. If you have more income, it's going to shift to the right or to the left. I hear some lefts, I hear some rights. So when you have more income, will you probably buy more pizza?
Yeah.
Will you also maybe tuck some away? Yes. So you're going to do both, actually, with more disposable income. So an increase in disposable income, for our purposes here, since we're talking about supply shifters, that is going to shift it to the right. Okay, so our next one is our wealth. Number 2. If you're a millionaire, what's true about your assets and liabilities? You have a lot, and how many debts do you have? None. So assets, the value of your assets, what you own, minus what you owe, is at least $1 million if you're a millionaire, right? So your wealth is equal to the value of your assets, what you own, minus the value of your liabilities, or what you owe. And so if you have an increase in wealth, your savings, if you will, kind of is already building. And so you tend to save less today. This one's a little bit strange. But remember, we're thinking about our income. And this is what we saw in the housing market. Housing prices went up, and people thought, oh, I'm rich. I can always use my house as collateral or whatever. And so, I don't need to save for tomorrow. And so they stopped saving as much as they were before because of what we call the wealth effect. Okay, so that's the wealth effect. And then the last one is expected future income. You guys are likely doing this now. Are you expecting to make more money once you're done with college compared to what you're making now?
Yes.
How many of you are expecting that? Okay, so what did that do to your savings today? Are you increasing your savings or decreasing your savings because of that reason? Decreasing, right? It's like, oh, I'll make more money tomorrow. I don't have to worry about saving today, right? So an increase in expected income leads to a decrease in the supply of loanable funds. You can kind of add on here, why save today when I'll be rich? Rich, I tell you, tomorrow. So this is where most college students find themselves in. All right, so that sets up the market. We'll, again, we'll have Jacob in on Friday, and he'll wrap up the rest of this chapter. What are you getting? Let's see. Not 79.9. Alright. Have my grades. Did you get it? Well, this one was actually new. So the first meeting was June on Tuesday. This Tuesday. I don't know what your schedule is like, but if you wanted to join the wait, I could probably still add you in. We haven't set what the other meeting times are. I can't rule out, but I have to shift or something. Basically, if you make it to only three of the meetings, then you get $30. And if you make it to only 2 of the meetings, you get $10. But you get a free book and pizza either way. So, and then it's going to be a pretty cool discussion on Tuesday. So, you want to try to do it still?
Yeah,
Okay.
I just assumed that it would be.
Okay. It's noon on Tuesday, so yeah, it'd be important for you to come to the first meeting. You can make that? Okay. Why don't you pull out your phone and look for my email that I sent, because I think I sent you the link, and then we can go to my office and I'll give you a copy of that book. Question? We got a true sheet? What's your percentage on like 63? So you gotta do some makeup or something, or? All right. Yeah, because we talked already, right, on making up some stuff, or the previous, okay.
If I'm missing class on Monday for the report,
Yeah?
then can I just look at your show online? Like, how do I get class?
Yeah, so